Polar and nonpolar covalent bonds. This is a concept that we're going to talk about over and over again through the course of the year because the polarity of water and the nonpolarity of lipids is really important for the way that a cell membrane is put together. And every cell has a cell membrane, and so what can go through a cell membrane really has to do with what's polar and what's nonpolar. So, and since every living thing is made out of cells, that becomes super, super important. So this might seem like, okay, chemistry, I can't wait to be done with chemistry and get into biology. But really the whole polar, non-polar thing is super, super important. So we're talking about covalent bonds. You can think of co as, I don't know, like a co-teacher is when both teachers are teaching. Co is when you're both doing something. So co is really strong. Covalent bonds are when there are electrons that are shared. So let's take a look at these. First, we're going to talk about polar bonds. Unequal sharing of electrons produces, so I said bonds, I meant polar molecules. So here's a polar molecule. Here's water, and water is bent. You don't need to know why it's bent, but you need to know that it's bent. And it's got a partial negative charge here and a partial positive charge here, and I'm going to show you why that is. So first of all, before we even get there, I want you to think of poles. So I don't want you to think of like a telephone pole or something. I want you to think of magnetic poles, for example, so the Earth's north and south poles. So I don't really like the way they do this, but I want you to get the idea of a north pole and a south pole. And so these are magnetic poles, just like you see in a magnet. So here's just a regular bar magnet, and you've got a north pole and you've got a south pole. And so what I want you to think about these things is that they are opposites. The north pole is opposite from the south pole, and you can tell that because if you take two magnets, and here's one magnet, and let's say this is the north side of it. Do you know what happens if you take another magnet and you put the north side to it? Hopefully you remember this from a younger grade. They repel each other. But if you do the opposite ones, if you have the north side of one, whoops, and it's facing the south side of another, they'll attract. So you know that the north and the south are different things. They're opposite things. Some molecules have poles too. And I know at this point you're like, I don't know what this has to do with anything. But I'm about to tell you what you really need to know about polar molecules. You ready? Here's a diagram of water. The reason that polar molecules are so important is because water is polar. So we need to talk about water first, and then we'll look at other polar molecules. So here's a diagram of water, which is H2O. You see two H's and an O. Each hydrogen shares an electron with oxygen. Actually, it's an electron pair, right? So one of the electrons from oxygen and one of the electrons from hydrogen, and they'll go spinning around both. Same thing with this, they're sharing an electron pair, it should probably say. You should probably fix that in your notes if I haven't gone in and fixed it. So an electron pair with oxygen. So they'll all have happy filled, stable outer energy levels. This one, instead of having one proton, instead of having one electron, will now have two. It's sharing one from oxygen and one from hydrogen. So it's going around both. So they're happy and stable. Meow. If you were one of these shared electrons, so let's look. Here are the shared electrons. This one belonged to hydrogen, and maybe this one belonged to oxygen. And here are the shared electrons. Maybe this one belonged to hydrogen, and that one belonged to oxygen. So if you were one of these shared electrons, would you be more attracted to those 8 protons that are in oxygen, or the puny single proton in hydrogen? So hydrogen has 1 proton. And this I can show you on the periodic chart, but if you just trust me on this one, hydrogen is little. It's only got 1 proton. And I don't need you to memorize this, I just need you to understand it. Oxygen has 8 protons. So you don't have to memorize that oxygen has 8 protons. But if I'm telling you it has 8 protons, and I'm telling you hydrogen has just 1 proton, here's what I want you to know. These 2 electrons, if they're being shared by the hydrogen and the oxygen, would they be more attracted to the 8 positives or the 1 positive if you're a negative? And the answer is they are going to be more attracted to the 8. So they're going to actually spend more time around here, and they'll go out here once in a while, but they're going to spend a lot more time in here. And the same with these. They'll go around here, and they'll come out here once in a while, but they're going to spend much, much more of their time in here. And so what that does, I'll show you on the next slide. So the shared electrons are more attracted to the oxygen atom, and so they spend more time there. So the oxygen side, here's the thing. If the electrons are spending more time here, remember electrons are negative. If they're spending more time here, then the oxygen side is more negative, and that means the hydrogen side over here is more positive. So you can write this side as negative in parentheses. That means it's a partial negative. It's not an ion. It doesn't have a full negative charge, but it's got a partial charge, which means this side, you can either write it near the hydrogens or you can write it here if you want, whatever. So that side, you write this way. There's also kind of this funky sign you can use. That means partially negative, partially positive. If you want to write that, you can do that instead. But the idea is, if the electrons are spending more time here, and the electrons are negative, then this side's going to be more negative. You've still got those pluses here, but the electrons don't spend much time here. They spend way more of their time here. So this side is going to end up being more positive because it's got that proton in the nucleus here without the electrons out here too much. So just to define this, a polar molecule is a molecule with an uneven charge distribution due to shared electrons spending more time on one side. So this side being partially negative, this side being partially positive. Don't forget to put in your parentheses or your funky little negative sign or funky little partial positive sign. Here are some other polar molecules. So you don't have to memorize this, but here's what I want you to see. Look at this. Does that look like anything else you've seen in the last 5 minutes? What molecule am I drawing? So hopefully you said a water molecule. And we said already that this oxygen side, I'm drawing it upside down compared to the one we just drew, but this side is partly negative because there's so many protons that all of those shared electrons, they spend more of their time here. And they don't spend much time here, so there's not very many negatives over here, and so that side is partially positive. Now if you look, let me change colors. If you look at this, doesn't that look a whole lot like this? So this is also a polar molecule. Here's another example. Here's oxygen out here and carbon here. So you might get a little dipole going on there too. Here's another polar molecule. This is a type of carbohydrate. And so if you see OH, again, that's looking a lot like water, looking a lot like this. So here's an OH, here's an OH, here's an OH. I'm not going to give you a bunch of molecules and ask you which ones are polar and which ones are nonpolar. I'm going to ask you, what do polar molecules do in water and what do nonpolar molecules do in water? That's the important thing for you to get here. Here's just another picture of this with the OHs hanging off. So anytime you see an OH, that's going to be polar and it's going to mix well with water. This is glucose, by the way. And that is crazy cute. And I think that's it for right now. We'll do nonpolar in the next segment.